Today's story takes us down under, all the way to Australia, where a young man named Jake shares the harrowing experiences he endured in the family home. Imagine being a teenager, living in a rural area, and sensing that something beyond this world is sharing your space, only no one believes you. Jake grew up in a remote part of New South Wales, in a house his father had lived in since his early 20s. Nothing strange ever happened there for years, but for Jake and his siblings, odd events started cropping up. Small things, like strange whispers and objects mysteriously moving. Though the family brushed it off, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with the house. Jake described his ability to sense bad vibes in certain rooms, an intuition he called his spooky radar. One room in particular, the spare room at the end of the hallway, gave him chills even as a kid. He and his siblings avoided it whenever possible. But when he turned 12, Jake's parents announced it was time for him to have his own space, and the spare room was his new bedroom. At first, he tried to ignore his fear, but as he settled in, strange things escalated. Whispering noises, faint but persistent, would start up as soon as he tried to sleep. Then came the footsteps. Quiet, carpeted yet unmistakable. They would approach his bed, then vanish without a trace. Jake dismissed it as his imagination until he felt something distinctly terrifying. One night, lying in bed, Jake felt his blanket shifting. He thought it was slipping between the bed and wall. But then a cold, heavy hand pressed on his back, 5 fingers, a full palm. It wasn't human warmth, it was just there. Jake jolted awake, ripped himself from bed, and ran from the room, shaken to the core. Jake's family still wouldn't believe him. As he lay awake night after night, he tried to tune out the whispering by keeping a fan on, but it only seemed to grow louder. Desperate, he asked friends for advice. One, an avid horror movie fan named Connor, suggested he try recording the strange events. Unfortunately, every attempt failed. Devices would mysteriously stop recording, or the storage would inexplicably fill up. Jake's nights in the spare room became a nightmare cycle. His once ordinary space felt like a battleground. In a moment of desperation, Jake turned to prayer, hoping it would provide some protection. He whispered a plea, asking for strength to rid his room of whatever entity haunted it. To Jake's astonishment, as he said his final words, "Be gone," the shadow reappeared. It grew taller, larger than before, and swept out of the room in a blur, scattering posters and belongings as if caught in a small whirlwind. But from that night on, the spare room was silent. For years, Jake lived without incident, but the memory haunted him. Once, at 15, his sister let out a scream after seeing the figure lurking behind him, a dark, hooded shape watching silently before it fled. Although Jake had pushed the memory away, his sister's reaction reignited his fear. In a bizarre twist, Jake began experiencing sleep paralysis. Each time, the figure would appear, pressing down on his chest, cloaked and ominous. Though paralyzed, Jake felt a strange, almost familiar connection, as if the entity recognized him. The encounters stopped after Jake's teenage years, but he remembers them vividly. To this day, he's unsure if it was simply his imagination or something otherworldly bound to that house. Whether it was an attachment or mere coincidence, Jake's story serves as a reminder. Sometimes, things we can't see or understand lurk closer than we think. If you've experienced something unexplainable, or eerie, leave a comment below. And remember, just because you can't see them doesn't mean they aren't there.